Last week, if you were with us, you might remember that I used the analogy of the Christmas meal as the ultimate balanced meal. If you could have the Christmas meal every day, I reckon it would give you the ultimate balanced diet. Okay, I was being a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I was using that image of the Christmas meal to help us to think about our prayer lives, and particularly about the variety of prayer life that we might have. How we might, for whatever reason, choose to focus on maybe just one or two different styles of prayer. Maybe that's the tradition that we have grown up with, or the church style that we're more used to. But I was encouraging us in this season of prayer that we are entering into to be open to a variety of different prayer styles, or different ways of encountering and meeting with God. And last week we thought about corporate prayer, the importance of interceding together as a church family, gathering regularly to bring before God those needs that are in our world or in our lives. And today we are thinking about personal prayer, and particularly about contemplative prayer. And my hope and prayer is that over the next few weeks, as we look at these different styles, these different ways of praying, it might unlock something within you. That maybe you feel like those old ways or habits of praying are just not reviving your soul anymore. They're not maybe sustaining your spirituality in the way that they once did. Maybe there is something that will be unlocked within you in the coming weeks as you encounter a new way of praying. But as we come to explore personal prayer, and particularly contemplative prayers, often, if we think about that analogy of a meal, praying on our own can be a bit like the vegetables. It's something that we know that we should do, but we don't necessarily want to. But it's my hope and prayer that for myself firstly, but for all of us, personal prayer would move from being a discipline to a delight. It would move from being a discipline to a delight. But often we have to go through that process of discipline to come to that place where it is a delight, where it is a joyful, wonderful experience. And so for the next 10 minutes or so, what I'm going to do is just to give us a picture or a vision for what this personal contemplative prayer might look like to inspire us. And then I'm really excited to invite Sue James, who has a way more experience than I do in this area. She's going to share just a bit of her journey and is going to share about how we might engage with this style of prayer a bit more. As I was preparing for this talk, I was listening to a very well-known speaker and writer, and he was describing his own personal prayer life and what it was for him. He talked so passionately about how it was a life-giving, transformative, beautiful, all-consuming experience, how he came daily to the face of God and met God in that place, being fully known and fully loved. Now, I'm sure he would say that it wasn't an everyday, absolutely regular thing that he prayed in that way or experienced God in that way. But I wanted to be honest with you that as I heard him sharing, I felt actually my prayer life, my personal prayer life, is so far from that. And I have no doubt seen and experienced glimpses. I've tasted, but it's not something that I experience regularly in the way, at least, that he was describing. But what I will say is that it is something that I long for. It's something that I yearn for in my own personal life. And I want to suggest that this morning that the primary goal of personal private prayer is presence. The primary goal of personal prayer is presence. It is about seeking and finding presence in our Heavenly Father. But it can be that often our private prayer lives can be too weighted towards intercession, praying for people and situations in our lives, which are no doubt really important. Praying can become, as the late Tim Keller put it, worrying in God's general direction, worrying in God's general direction. When we come to pray, our prayers can be more expressions of anxiety rather than avenues for healing. And when we look out in the world, when we read the newspapers, when we watch TV, when we see our social media streams, we can be so filled with the desperate need of our world that when we come to God in prayer, that is all that we can focus on. We can be consumed by the needs that are out there. And again, we need to be interceding. Please, please do hear me. But how often maybe that we become consumed with the anxiety and the worry of our world, that we're not finding intimacy with our Father. We present our worries to God without seeking transformation or aligning our desires with His will, therefore missing the deeper relational aspect of prayer. Here at St. Gabriel's, I'm so grateful for our healing and wholeness team particularly, because I know that every single day there is somebody in our church who is interceding for the needs of individuals in our church. That is so important. But God is longing for intimacy with His children. He's longing to find us and to meet with us, to grow in a deep and a real and a raw, authentic relationship. He is longing for presence. I've been recently going through the marriage course, helping to prepare a couple who are getting married very soon. And in the course, it talks about 3 different levels of communication, 3 levels of communication that are needed within a marriage, within any relationship, really. The first is passing on information. That's level 1. And maybe you can already think of people in your lives who you're at that type of relationship with, passing on of information. The second level is sharing our ideas and opinions, a slightly deeper level of relationship where we're willing to share things with people about our ideas and opinions, level 2. And then level 3 is where we are open with our feelings and needs. Where we're open with our feelings and needs. And maybe you can already think of people in your lives who you relate to at those 3 different levels. And of course, the course encourages the couples to think about where their relationship is at and whether they do have that third level of relationship and communication, where they're open with their feelings and their needs. I think for many of us, our communication with God stays at level 1. It's about the passing on of information. God, here are my needs or the needs of others in my life. Here is this information, I pray to you. And maybe there is a bit of communication that comes back as well, but it always stays at level 1. What would it look like to go deeper, where we come to a place where we are open with God about our feelings and our needs, the whole variety and complexity of those, if you're anything like me, where we can come and be honest and raw and open with God. We all know that intimacy only comes at that level 3 of communication, but it requires vulnerability and trust. I want to acknowledge, as I have done before, that for many of us, we struggle or struggling to get to that level 3 because we're struggling to trust God. And rebuilding that is going to take time and honesty. And it may mean being vulnerable before God and saying, God, actually, I don't trust you at the moment. I've been hurt by people saying and doing things in your name, but I suppose I'm here. And I want to explore how to restore that trust. There is also an aspect that our personal prayer lives have been hijacked by a world full of distractions. I wonder if you remember being bored. Do you remember that? I remember it a long time ago. I don't get bored very often because I've got one of these. Do you remember ever standing in a queue at the supermarket and just thinking, just looking round? Because more often than not, when I'm in a queue at the supermarket, I'm scrolling through my phone. Remember boiling a kettle and not reaching for your phone as well, or not getting distracted by someone else? I think growing up in the 90s, I remember being bored, but my kids just can't cope with being bored. There is so much to distract them. We live in a world full of distractions. We live in a world which is seeking to draw our attention and then to monetize that attention. And so finding space and quiet and silence with God is so difficult in the world that we live in. But similar to personal relationships, you can gauge the level of intimacy with someone with how comfortable you are with silence. Early on, relationships are often based on lots of words. It's conversation, and it's important as we get to know each other. But as you grow closer to someone, you're more at ease with one another. You're more at ease at times where you can just rest together and be quiet, to be silent. I think that is where God is wanting to lead us, where we can rest together with him, where we know that it is beyond words. Before she died, Mother Teresa was interviewed by a guy called Dan Rather. He was a CBS anchor. And he asked Mother Teresa, "When you talk to God, what do you say?" She answered, "I don't say anything. I listen." So Dan turned the question and said, "Well then, when you pray to God, what does God say?" Mother Teresa smiled with confidence and answered, "He doesn't say anything. He listens." For an instant, the interviewer, Dan, didn't know what to say. But Mother Teresa responded. She says, "And if you don't understand that, I can't explain it to you." St. John of the Cross called this silent love, a prayer that goes beyond speaking to God or even listening to God. It is a yielding to him, letting go of outcomes, moving beyond petition, releasing our lives to God, and actively turning our whole being to him. In 2 Corinthians, we see this type of prayer touched on as Paul is writing about coming before God where the veil is lifted. And he speaks to God in a way, and he describes an intimacy which is extraordinary, which is in contrast to the old ways of coming before God, of the Old Testament. He says this at the end of chapter 3, 2 Corinthians chapter 3. "But whenever someone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. For the Lord is the Spirit, and wherever the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom." So all of us who have had that veil removed can see and reflect the glory of the Lord. And the Lord, who is the Spirit, makes us more and more like him as we are changed into his glorious image. In this chapter, Paul is contrasting the old covenant with the new. The old covenant that God had with his people before Jesus was based on the law. It was based on condemnation. But this new covenant in Jesus is based on grace and accepting his grace through the forgiveness of sins. The Spirit of God then makes it possible to encounter and meet with God. And so the barrier is lifted. As Paul says, whenever someone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. This lifting of the veil makes it possible for us to encounter God through his Spirit. It makes it possible for us to contemplate, to see and reflect the glory of God, to see and reflect his presence, his beauty and his goodness. And so Paul says, as we do that, we are changed. We can't help but be transformed. It does something before us as we encounter the face of God. We become more and more like Jesus, and we are changed into his glorious image. I think Paul is touching on contemplative prayer. As we contemplate God, as we gaze on Him, as we encounter His presence, His beauty and His goodness, we become more like Him. It echoes the psalmist who says, "Be still and know that I'm God." Be still. Stop all the trying, you're gaining, you're achieving, you're wanting more, and know. The Hebrew words in that Psalm 46, verse 10, is yada. It implies a deep, personal, relational knowledge, such as the intimate relationship with God and His people or between individuals. And in ancient Hebrew culture, knowledge was not merely intellectual, but it was deeply relational and emotional. If you understand something intellectually, it will only go so far to transform you. But we all know that understanding something in your head needs to take deep root in your heart and your lives for it to truly become transformative. Be still and know that I am God. This is contemplative prayer. The Message translation of that in Psalm 46 says, "Step out of the traffic. Take a long, loving look at me, your high God, above politics, above everything." Contemplation starts when we step out of the traffic and find that space. And as we heard in our passage from Matthew, it is modeled by Jesus again and again. He so often retreated to that quiet space, to that mountaintop, to come before God, come before His Heavenly Father, to contemplate who He is, His identity as the Son of God. Jesus sought presence with His Father. He sought the Father's guidance and direction. He retreated in the early hours of the morning or up a mountain to seek God, to meditate, to commune with Him and His presence. In a few moments, I'm going to invite Sue to come up and speak to us. I'm going to ask her a few questions. But just a word of advice, if you are wanting to explore this a bit deeper, Father Ronald Rolheiser said this: "There's no bad way to pray, or no single starting point for prayer. The spiritual masters offered one non-negotiable rule. You have to show up for prayer and show up regularly. Everything else is negotiable and respects your unique circumstances." So if this is something that you want to go deeper in, it starts very simply by showing up and showing up regularly. Now, Sue, it'd be wonderful to invite you up because you're going to help us to go even deeper with this. And just a few questions that I would love to ask you, if that's all right. So firstly, just tell us a bit about your journey towards and into contemplative prayer.
Yeah. My journey began with restlessness in my early 40s. So my background is evangelical. My father was a church army captain, and I grew up in the church. And I stayed with it through college and family and everything. And I got to my early 40s. And at that time in my life, everything was fairly settled, except my prayer life, which suddenly seemed to go to pot. I found it stale. I couldn't sort of find anything from it. It wasn't uplifting. And I was very puzzled about that. And there was, for a long time, this restlessness. Looking back on that experience now, I see it as invitation. I was in a bit of a rut, and I needed to let go of what I was doing and to explore other ways of finding God in my life, really, and in prayer. Thankfully for me, my journey led to Worlow Spirituality Centre. I don't know if everybody knows about Worlow. It's it was then a diocesan retreat house. It's down at Ecclesall Road South, and the retreat house is no longer there, but the chapel is there. And the chapel is a place of peace and stillness. And I attended there over quite a few years, still coming here as well, but going to things that put on at Worlow. And I came across many helpful prayer styles. Ignatian way of imaginative prayer, putting yourself in a gospel story, Celtic prayer, the monastic rhythms of prayer, praying with art, praying with a poem, all sorts of things. And Werlo do a course called Spiritual Growth and Transformation. And I went on that course, and each day of the course that they hold, they do a different prayer style. And one day they held a 20-minute silence. I had never experienced that before, and that really spoke to me, and I was thrilled by that. And from that, particularly, I sought that particular style of being seeking to be just in the presence of God. My present practice is something called centering prayer, which is where you come before God just as you are, in silence, stilling and in silence. Now, obviously, if you go into silence, you're going to have a lot of thoughts. All sorts of thoughts are going to be in your mind. And centering prayer offers the practice of having a prayer word. It can be any word you like, love, peace, Jesus, to help you to come back to that place of waiting and stillness. So you don't try and push the thoughts away, you don't engage with the thoughts, you just come back to that prayer word, bringing you back to that place of stillness.
You've touched on it already, but what do you think are the key aspects of contemplative prayer, if you could distill it?
I think, as you've already mentioned, at the time apart, making that place, an intentionality, intention to do it, to be still, to come before God, with resting in God, asking for nothing, just being, as you said, with God. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's called the prayer of loving attentiveness. That's quite a useful phrase, I think.
Yeah. Some might think that contemplative prayer might lead to a very personal or a private faith. Can you tell us a bit about maybe the corporate nature of it, or how it can impact our mission and our focus to the world and outwardsly?
Yeah. I think the contemplative always involves action, because it is a transformative practice, and it will affect how you are in the world, I think. Centering prayer makes a claim that it makes you more peaceful, and that's a peace you offer into the world. But it isn't just, it will affect how you are and how you are with other people.
And that's been the case for you in your work, do you think? Or?
Especially in the work, because I meet people daily who are quite anxious and have very difficult things in their life. I need to be grounded, and I also need to be able to come back from the emotions that I fight, and to find that peace and that stillness myself, but also to be in that place so that I can offer that to them.
Yeah. You mentioned at the very start that sense of restlessness as you got into your 40s. So if somebody is feeling that sense of restlessness now, what would you suggest as how they could take those first steps towards contemplative prayer?
I think, as you've already said, to try and build that into your daily life, and to be intentional about it. How you could get support with it. I would particularly encourage people to look at the Werlo programme. There may be things there that would be helpful. If you've got the opportunity to go on to retreat, perhaps away for a few days, do look at the Retreat Association. They explain all different retreats, and there are all sorts of things going on all over the country. I have to say I found books enormously helpful, and I used to be able to wander into SBCK, and I realise people can't do that now. If you're interested in centering prayer, I would particularly recommend a book called Into the Silent Land, and I would particularly recommend the School of Contemplative Life, who do it on websites. And of course we do have websites now, but if anybody wants to talk to me about any resources as well, if you're interested in the Celtic, do speak to Mark, because he's a member of the Northumbria community. And it is speaking to people and being open. But I do think that we can take heart here, that seek and you will find. Things came on my books at particular times, very helpfully came upon my path. And I think if you come before God like that, you'll find your path. It may take a while, but be open and note what draws you and what resonates with you, I would say, particularly. Yeah.
And just final question, I didn't suggest this, but maybe some of us live very, very busy lives, children, young children. How do we start to engage with this in the midst of the busyness of life and so many distractions?
I think it's that intentionality to lay aside the time. It might have to be a different time each day, but to make that space, put it in as important as cleaning your teeth or doing anything else. It really is important. See where you can build that in and find perhaps a place where in your house is the best place for you to pray. Do you need is there something you can do to make a bit of a prayer area, perhaps a candle or something like that, just so that it's a daily focus and it's important to you, it's your relationship with God. So in the same way that you might make time to be with a partner or a relative, you're making time to be with God. And that's really important. Okay.
So we're Mary's going to lead us as we sing in a few moments, but just tell us a bit about what you're going to lead us into, just as we try to practice this a bit.
This was a practice I came across called Review of the Day, also called the Examen. And it's a way just of looking back over the day and having a sense of where God was with you in that day. It's going to be very short. You can make them quite a bit longer. And it'd be looking back. Now, it's usually done at the end of the day. Obviously, we're not at the end of the day at the moment, so you might want to think about the day before or this morning or whatever. But it's just a rhythm. Again, if you're interested in it, there's lots of examples of the Examen, Review of the Day on the web. But we'll go through, just very shortly go through that.
Great, thank you. So I think I was really keen that when we explore these different types of prayer, that on a Sunday we tend to spend a bit of time practicing it together. And so Mary and Matt are going to come and lead us in our next song. I'm going to invite you to stay seated for that, and you might not want to sing, but we're going to use this song to draw us into that place of stillness, that place of presence of the Lord. And then Sue is going to lead us in that Examen prayer to hopefully give you a tool that you might want to go away with and to just help us all this morning to encounter God together. So let's sing.